It started with a line on a palace entry list that almost nobody ever reads. One line, a category code, a date, and a handful of names that had no business being on that sheet on that morning, sitting there looking as ordinary as everything above and below them. That is the thing I need you to hold on to for the next half hour, because everything that follows came out of it. The royal briefing had barely started when Princess Anne stopped listening. Beyond the closed circle of senior royals and palace officials, through an adjoining doorway stood several members of Queen Camilla's family. Inside a restricted area in a part of that building where nobody had expected to see them and nobody had put them on any list that the people at that table had seen. Anne turned toward her brother and lowered her voice. Seconds later, the king's hand came up. A senior aide stopped mid-sentence, and the most powerful man in Britain demanded to know who had authorized the entry. Before we go deeper into what this means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Quick word before we go further, I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the filings, the household records, the procedures nobody outside those walls ever sees. And what you are about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end because Anne asked one more question in that room after the briefing stopped. And the answer to it is the reason any of us are talking about this at all. Charles had called that meeting to settle things that sit outside ordinary palace routine. Around the table were Anne, William, Camilla, and the senior officials trusted with decisions about household access, ceremonial planning, residential arrangements, and the line between family life and royal duty. Nobody else was on the list. That is the part that matters. No extended relatives, no casual visitors, nothing anywhere near that corridor. Anne leaned toward Charles and said one sentence, "Explain those people to me." Charles did not answer straight away. His face changed first, and people who were there describe it as the look of a man doing arithmetic he does not want the answer to. Then his hand went up and stopped an official in the middle of a briefing note. The room went completely quiet. He said the meeting would go no further until somebody explained who had approved the entry. Quick note before we continue. Everything I dig up that doesn't make it into these videos, I put into a free weekly letter. Join more than 10,000 royal insiders at crownletter.com. The link is in the pinned comment below. If you're watching on your TV, just point your phone at the QR code on screen. And honestly, put yourself in her position for 1 second. Your relatives are standing on the other side of a door. Everybody in the room has now turned to look at that door, and you have no idea why they are there or who let them in. Camilla stiffened in her chair, and she understood the question faster than anybody else at that table. Anne was not objecting to a family visit. Anne was asking whether private access had crossed into official royal space and whether somebody had moved that line without telling a single person sitting in that room. William said nothing at all, and his attention went off his father and onto his aunt. An official went to check the internal entry list. That took about 90 seconds. And I want you to picture 90 seconds of silence in a room containing a king, his wife, his sister, and his heir, with nobody looking at anybody. The answer came back with the kind of precision that makes everything worse. Special access had been approved under a household authorization category, the sort normally used for guests connected directly to the sovereign and the queen. And that phrase is where this whole thing turns. So let me give it to you properly. Anything logged under the household of their majesties reads to every member of staff who sees it as though the king and queen have personally signed it off. It is not an invitation. It is a standing instruction and staff obey standing instructions without asking twice, because asking twice is how people lose jobs in that building. Charles asked who had signed off on it. The official hesitated. Camilla looked toward the list. Anne did not look at the list because Anne had already worked it out, and I think that is the detail that tells you the most about her. Then Anne went back over the entry sheet, and William watched the concern settle across his aunt's face in real time. The problem had stopped being that Camilla's family had walked into a palace. Any of that family can walk into a palace on the right day with the right paperwork. The problem was that somebody had made their presence look routine, expected, almost protected by the system itself. Charles had stopped one meeting. Anne had already started to suspect that the story began a long way before anybody walked through that door, and she was right. And I am going to hold the proof back for a while because I want you to understand the 4 people at that table first. Give it 20 minutes, and the ledger will make your jaw drop. From outside, this looks painfully simple. Relatives got into a palace. Anne objected. Charles demanded answers. Everybody went home cross. Nothing about it was simple, and every one of those 4 people was standing in a different argument. Camilla saw people she loves being talked about like a security incident. Anne saw a constitutional boundary going soft. William saw a precedent that will one day be his problem to live with. And Charles found himself doing the thing he has spent his entire marriage trying to avoid, choosing between defending his wife and defending the rules that hold up his own crown. Charles understood the danger better than anyone in the room, and the danger was never what had happened. It was what it could be made to look like. And he has a reason for being careful about it that goes back further than most people watching this remember. His marriage to Diana came apart in public across 10 years of front pages with 2 households briefing against each other and half the country picking a side. Charles has spent the 20 years since building something quiet with Camilla, and he has spent every one of them terrified of anything that turns it into a story again. For years, he has tried to protect the private side of that marriage without letting personal loyalty leak into royal business. Camilla's children and grandchildren are part of his family life, and he has never pretended otherwise. The palace is also a working institution where access carries status, influence, and implied authority. And once private affection starts shaping official privilege, even by accident, putting that line back is close to impossible. Anne's instinct runs in a completely different direction, and honestly, it always has. She has spent 55 years treating royal duty as something built on discipline, clear hierarchy, and rules strong enough to survive whoever happens to be standing in them at the time. She has no objection to family warmth. She has very little patience for an arrangement that nobody in the room can explain. Look at what that woman has done with her own family, because it is the whole answer to why she reacted the way she did. Anne asked decades ago that her own children be given no titles, and they have none to this day. She had every right to hand them the thing everybody else in that family hands their children, and she declined it. She spent her entire life inside an institution built on titles and refused to spend a penny of it on her own kids. And look at the working record while we are on it. Court circular totals for last year put Anne on 478 official engagements against the King's 532, and she covered hers across more working days than anybody else in that family at 75 years old. She isn't defending a principle from a comfortable distance. She has been earning the right to raise it for 55 years. Then she walked into a briefing and found somebody else's relatives inside a restricted corridor on a standing permission. That is why Camilla came to find her after the meeting was suspended and the frustration was all over her. She asked Anne whether she honestly believed her relatives were the problem. Anne held her gaze and gave her 7 words. Your family is not the question, access is. Camilla said nothing for a moment, and the hurt in that silence was visible to the aide standing at the far end of the corridor. William picked his words more carefully when he got his father alone later. The prince told Charles that whatever came next could not rest on whether anybody personally trusted Camilla's family, because personal trust dies with the people who feel it, and a precedent does not. A precedent outlives everybody in the room. It sits in a filing system and waits. And one day, somebody who never met any of these people finds it and treats it as the way things are done. William warned him that if unexplained family privilege became normal now, a future sovereign would inherit expectations that nobody had ever consciously approved. Charles listened all the way through without interrupting once because his son was describing a problem considerably larger than one uncomfortable afternoon. And I keep coming back to why William, of all of them, went straight to precedent rather than to the row in front of him. He watched this institution shaped Diana's life and then shaped the story of it after she died. And he has spent his adult life building rules around his own family that nobody can quietly rewrite later. He does not argue about the incident. He argues about what the incident becomes in 30 years. Then Camilla admitted something that sharpened all of it. She had known members of her family would be inside the palace that day. She said it plainly, and she insisted she had believed the visit was properly cleared and completely separate from the briefing. Charles turned to a senior aide and asked whether he had personally approved the authorization. The answer came back quietly, no. Somebody inside the Queen's household had used standing access procedures without going anywhere near the sovereign for direct approval. And that is when Anne asked the question. Nobody in that room wanted to be the person to answer. Was this the first time? Silence, not the polite kind. The kind where officials look at their folders and a king looks at his staff instead of at his wife. Charles looked at his staff instead of Camilla, and everything about the crisis changed shape in that second. I am going to hold the answer to Anne's question, and I want to be straight that I am doing it on purpose. If I give it to you now, it is a date and a filing reference, and you will nod and move on. It explains why a household official lost a career and a queen consort sat alone in a room and asked to be left there. Because the palace records were about to show the exact moment an innocent family arrangement turned into something else entirely. Weeks before Charles halted that briefing, there had been another gathering inside the palace, smaller, warmer, completely harmless on the face of it. Camilla's family joined her after a private dinner. Staff moved through the rooms without a second thought. Nobody objected to anything publicly or otherwise. During that evening, one brief conversation created an informal arrangement, and that arrangement is the thing that eventually blew up a royal briefing. Anne remembered it clearly because she had heard enough of it to know a boundary was being tested. And I want to be fair to Camilla here because this story does not work if you make her a cartoon. She never wanted becoming queen to mean losing the people who knew her before any of this started. Her children and grandchildren are her private world, and they were her private world for decades before she had a title. Charles understands that completely. He has never had any interest in turning his marriage into isolation. And honestly, given what that man's first marriage looked like from the outside, you can see exactly why the palace is not home. That is the thing that catches everybody eventually. People live there, people also work there, and the two things happen in the same building, sometimes in rooms 20 ft apart, and the only thing separating them is a set of procedures nobody outside those walls has ever read. Household channels, the internal staff systems that arrange visits and rooms and security and schedules, can turn a small convenience into something that looks entirely official the moment it enters the system. Nobody has to intend anything. The system does it on its own because the system is built to be obeyed rather than questioned. Anne had already sensed that coming. She warned a courtier weeks before any of this that repeated exceptions become customs if nobody challenges them. She wasn't accusing anybody's family of anything. She was worried about something quieter and much harder to reverse, which is staff becoming so used to helping a particular group of people move through private areas that eventually nobody in the building remembers where the original limit was. Camilla heard about that warning and took it personally, and I understand why she did. To her, it did not sound like caution. It sounded like one more reminder that her family would always be the outsiders in that building, no matter how many years went by. Then came the dinner that changed everything. 3 weeks before the suspended briefing, Camilla mentioned that visiting relatives kept being held up at internal security points despite having planned invitations. Ordinary domestic irritation. Anybody who has ever had a family member stuck at a gate knows the feeling. A household official offered her a solution. A standing family access designation would fix it. A standing designation means an ongoing permission entered into palace procedures once, so the same approval does not have to be requested every single time. It is meant to save everybody a phone call. It is also, and this is the whole story, only ever as narrow as the word somebody types into it. Anne was passing the adjoining room and heard enough of the exchange to stop walking. Think about how narrow that is. One woman happening to be in a corridor at the exact moment somebody offered a convenient solution to a small problem. 10 seconds later, and this story does not exist, and the designation sits in that system for years. Camilla believed the conversation was about smoother access to private residential rooms. She had no reason that evening to think it would touch official space, and nothing in what she asked for suggested it would. Anne heard something considerably more dangerous. The official told the Queen Consort that once it was entered, nobody should trouble them again. That sentence stayed with her. Think about the shape of it for a second. Nobody should trouble them again. That is not a sentence about a security desk in a residential wing. That is a sentence with no edges on it at all. Charles knew nothing about the exchange at the time, and Anne chose not to go to him without proof that anything improper had happened, which is exactly the sort of restraint that makes her impossible to argue with later. The authorization did not stay narrow. Somewhere between that dinner and that briefing, the wording entered into the palace system became broad enough to allow movement near rooms used for official meetings. Whether that came from carelessness or from somebody being helpful in a way nobody asked them to be was still an open question. The consequence was no longer an open question because Anne had watched it walk past the doorway with her own eyes. She remembered the promise exactly. Camilla remembered the dinner completely differently, and Charles was about to find out that both of those versions could not survive in the same building. The door closed with no aids on either side of it. Anne stayed standing. Camilla faced her from across a small sitting room, both of them knowing that this particular conversation had been postponed in one form or another for something like 20 years. Anne did not accuse her of plotting anything, and that almost made it harder to sit through. An accusation you can fight. She repeated the sentence she had overheard 3 weeks earlier and asked whether Camilla understood what had been created in her name. Charles allowed that meeting because he wanted one thing stripped out of the situation before anybody made a decision. And that thing was misunderstanding. He believed the two of them needed to speak without officials shaping the words or protecting either woman from how uncomfortable it was going to get. Anne set out her position with no cushioning on it. She did not care that Camilla wanted her children and grandchildren close. She cared whether family affection had quietly turned into institutional privilege. Camilla's restraint finally went. She asked Anne whether she would have reacted with the same force if the visitors had belonged to a different branch of that family. Anne moved a chair aside and did not sit down in it. She answered that she would challenge anybody without exception the moment private relationships started shaping official procedure. Camilla heard the words. The wound underneath them was older and deeper than the argument in front of her. She told Anne she had spent years feeling that every ordinary comfort connected to her own family had to be defended as though it were somehow improper, as though loving them were a problem to be managed. Then her voice hardened, and she said she would not apologize for it. Anne did not retreat. She changed direction instead, and this is where the confrontation stopped being a fight and turned into something useful. She repeated the words from the dinner. According to Anne's own documented recollection given to Charles afterwards, the official had told Camilla that once the designation was entered, her relatives would not be questioned again. The phrase landed completely differently in that room than it had at the dinner table. Camilla's anger went out of her because she remembered what she had asked for. Smoother entry during planned family visits. Nothing about corridors, nothing about working areas, nothing about a briefing. She was sitting in herself. She answered straight away. She had never requested unrestricted access. She had never expected her relatives to turn up near a confidential meeting. She had never understood that a small request about private rooms had gone into the system with an effect that wide. Anne listened hard, and honestly, this is the first moment in the whole story where those two women were doing the same thing at the same time. They had stopped arguing about motives. They were comparing memories. Then the same name came up. Anne named the household official she had overheard that evening. Camilla named the same person. The room changed in about 2 seconds. 20 years of rivalry became the secondary matter because both of them were now looking in the same direction at the individual who had quietly turned a family convenience into a royal privilege. And now I owe you the thing I held back at the start. Charles came back into that briefing room carrying none of the warmth he had shown anybody earlier in the day, and he has had a difficult couple of years for this kind of thing to be happening under him. Buckingham Palace announced his cancer diagnosis in February 2024, and he was back on public duties by that April, faster than his doctors wanted. A king carrying that on a full diary is a king who has to trust his household to run the small things correctly. Somebody had put an access ledger in front of his chair along with the full authorization trail explaining how Camilla's relatives had reached that corridor. He read it in silence. He got to the last entry. He put the papers down without saying a word. William watched his father's face tighten and understood before anybody said anything out loud. Palace authority had been used without the crown having the faintest idea how far it reached. Charles read the authorization again slower. Household officials can arrange practical entry for approved visitors. That is their job, and it happens 100 times a week. Sensitive working areas sit under tighter control for the obvious reason. because private residence and official royal business were never meant to run into each other, and the whole system depends on the exact words somebody types when they set a permission up. One careless change turns a convenience into a privilege. That is the entire mechanism, and it is boring. And boring is precisely why nobody caught it for 3 weeks. William leaned in when he saw the category attached to the entry. It referenced the household of their majesties. The formal phrase for the king and queen together. Sit with that for a second. That wording made the authorization look to every member of staff who saw it as though it carried direct royal approval. Charles had never reviewed the expanded version. He had never seen it. His name was nowhere on it as a personal signature. His authority was on it anyway, and that is what changed his face. William told him quietly that intent had stopped being enough. If staff could manufacture the appearance of sovereign approval because nobody in the chain challenged the process, then the process itself was the problem, and no amount of goodwill in that room was going to fix it. Charles asked for the earlier version. That is where the answer to Anne's question was sitting, and it had been sitting there for 3 weeks. The original request had been limited. Scheduled family access, private residential areas, and that is all it said. Exactly what Camilla remembered asking for and exactly what she had described in that sitting room. Then somebody made a revision, one revision. It removed the location restriction. That single change meant the designation could be accepted across a far wider part of the building. It never said in so many words that Camilla's relatives could walk into confidential meetings. It stopped clearly saying they could not. And in a system where staff obey the wording rather than the intention, those two things are the same thing. William asked immediately who had approved the revision. Charles had already worked it out. The same household official Anne had overheard after that private dinner had authorized the change, and the internal record carries the description that person wrote next to it. A practical simplification, 3 words. Not a new privilege, not an expansion, not anything a colleague reviewing the file would stop and query. A practical simplification, logged and filed and forgotten, and it moved the boundary of a royal palace that killed the last of the doubt in that room. A minor adjustment had been handled as routine, and its effect had been nothing like minor. Charles made his decision on the spot. He ordered the designation suspended immediately and summoned the official responsible for a direct explanation. No further exceptional access of any kind would continue anywhere until the wording, the authority, and the responsibility behind it had been gone through line by line. Camilla found out about the suspension before her husband got a chance to tell her. And for the first time, the Queen Consort understood that this had stopped being an internal argument about procedure. Her family were already feeling it. The consequence turned up without any ceremony at all. One of Camilla's relatives came to an internal checkpoint later that day and was told politely that the standing family authorization had been suspended. No argument, no scene. A member of staff doing a job and a member of a family standing on the wrong side of a door that had opened for weeks. Camilla got the message and sat down beside a small table and did not move. No aide had told her it was coming. Nobody from her husband's office had rung ahead. She found out that her family had been turned away at a door in her own home from the family members standing on the wrong side of it. Think about what she was sitting in. A decision made to protect the institution had landed directly on the people she loves, and her own husband had authorized it, and she had found out from somebody else. Charles had already ordered every exceptional access arrangement connected to her extended family temporarily removed while the household rules were reviewed. Future visits would be scheduled individually and limited to approved private areas that mattered for more than security. It publicly put back the difference between a family guest and a royal participant, and everybody who works in that building saw it happen inside a day. The halted briefing was reconvened under stricter attendance procedures, which was a signal in itself. Charles intended to correct the boundary rather than let everybody quietly forget why the meeting had stopped. Camilla felt the cost almost immediately, and this is the part of the story that I think is going to stay with people. She took a call from a relative who had been turned back at a checkpoint, assuming the old arrangement still applied. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. She said a few quiet words. She ended the call. Whoever was on the other end of it had been embarrassed in front of a member of staff and had rung the one person they thought could fix it, and she could not. An aide was standing nearby waiting for an instruction. Camilla asked to be left alone. The humiliation was never that the access had gone. She could live with that, and she said so afterwards. It was that the people closest to her now looked as though they had been enjoying something improper when every one of them had believed the permission was legitimate because every one of them had been told it was. Charles came in later, knowing the conversation was going to hurt both of them. She told him she accepted the need for rules. She hated what the suspension implied about her family. He answered that the fault belonged to whoever created and expanded that authorization and not to relatives who had used it in good faith. She understood the logic. Logic did not do anything about it, and for the first time the crisis had gone past palace procedure and into their marriage. Anne heard about the suspension and refused to treat it as a win. She told William that if Camilla had never asked for broad access, then humiliating her family solved precisely nothing. And that is the sentence that turned this whole story around because it came from the woman who had started it. William agreed. He had already been thinking past the immediate mess. A rule aimed only at the queen consort's relatives would look like punishment rather than reform, and it would be argued about again under the next reign and the one after that. Then he put forward the thing that changed the direction of the entire crisis. One palace-wide standard for the private relatives of every senior royal, including his own. No family receiving automatic privilege because of personal closeness to the crown. Not Camilla's, not Catherine's, not his children's. When the time comes. Anne looked at her nephew differently after that. Camilla's pain had exposed the problem. William's answer could remove it for good. Anne, objecting to one family, had turned into a test of whether the future king was willing to put his own household under the same limits, and he walked into that conversation on his own. William came in without a private secretary. Camilla sent her aide out before he sat down. No official wording, no access lists, no courtier in the corner, deciding afterwards what either of them had meant. She expected criticism. She had spent the morning preparing for it. Instead, he told her he wanted the new rules to apply to everybody, including Catherine's family and eventually his own children's private circles. That one sentence changed the emotional balance of the entire crisis, and I do not think Camilla saw it coming for a second. William's reasoning was consistency and nothing else. He wanted a clear line between royal relatives, private family guests, and the people carrying out official duties on behalf of the crown. Everybody in that family has watched what happens when the line goes soft. Diana was inside that institution for 16 years and never once had a written rule to stand on. And William has never forgotten which side of that door his mother was left on. One unclear privilege becomes a future expectation, and a future expectation becomes a fight in somebody else's reign. He knew that if the rule depended on who happened to be liked or trusted or married in, the same argument would come back under the next monarch wearing different clothes. Camilla listened. Her fear was running underneath the procedure and had nothing to do with it. She was afraid the whole thing would confirm the oldest suspicion about her relatives, that they were outsiders benefiting from her marriage to Charles. She told him they had never created the disputed authorization and had never asked to be treated as part of the royal institution. Then she asked him the question she had been avoiding since the briefing stopped. She asked whether he personally believed she had crossed a line. William paused before he answered. And honestly, the pause is the most respectful thing in this entire story. He did not have a prepared line ready because he had not come in there to deliver one. And I think he was answering out of something older than this argument. He knows exactly what this institution does to a family that gets attached to it without clear rules around them. He watched it happen around Diana, and he has spent his whole adult life making sure nothing like it reaches Catherine or his own children. He told her he believed she had trusted a system that failed to explain what was being done in her name, and that this is a different thing from deliberately seeking special privilege. Then he went further than he needed to. The Middleton family, he said, should be under exactly the same standard. So should every private connection around his own household in the future, without exception and without anybody having to ask. Camilla looked at him differently after that. He was not isolating her. He was putting his own family under the same restraint at the same time in front of her before anybody asked him to. She made her decision in that room. She agreed to give up any remaining informal family access arrangements attached to her household, and she asked that future invitations state clearly whether somebody was entering as a private guest or an official participant. The reform would hurt less, she said, if nobody could pretend it had been designed only for her. William took the proposal to Anne afterwards. Anne approved it immediately and added one condition, and the condition tells you everything about how well that woman understands the country she has spent her life working for. She has been reading British public opinion since 1970, and she has been right about it more often than every press office that family has ever employed. Charles had to own the decision himself. If the change appeared to come only from Anne or from William, the public would read it as punishment aimed at Camilla rather than a rule protecting everybody. It would be a story about two royals ganging up on a queen consort, and it would run for a month. Charles accepted the argument without an argument and began preparing a household directive to apply across senior royal families with nobody exempted. Then the whole thing got out. By the next morning, the private confrontation was not private, and the image that went round the country was brutally simple. A king had stopped his own royal briefing after Princess Anne challenged the unexplained presence of Camilla's relatives inside the palace. Commentators split immediately. Half of them called it favoritism exposed. The other half called it proof that the monarchy can still police itself. Both of them were arguing about a version of the story that had large pieces missing from it. Camilla sat with Charles while the headlines repeated her family's name again and again and again. She had prepared herself for criticism of palace procedure. She had not prepared for the feeling of watching her children turn into symbols in a national argument they had never asked to be in and had done nothing to start. Anne would not back off the principle, and she said so. She told William privately that she would not soften her concern because the story had become uncomfortable. And then she admitted something considerably harder. She disliked watching Camilla's children carry the blame for an administrative decision they had not made and had never heard of. William agreed. He believed the scandal would only get worse if the monarchy let one family become the villain instead of explaining the wider rule that had failed everybody. Outside Buckingham Palace, the attention became impossible to ignore. Television crews were set up near the gates. Visitors stopped on the pavement to watch broadcasts on their phones. One newspaper front page got held up toward the cameras with a line across the top. King halts briefing in Palace Access Row. 6 words and not one of them wrong. And every one of them pointing at a version of the story where a king had to stop his own meeting because he did not know who was in his own building. Then a man standing near the barrier said one sentence to a broadcaster, and it did more damage and more good than everything the palace produced that week. Same rules for every family. That is all people expect. That went everywhere inside 2 hours, and it went everywhere because it cut straight through the noise. The story had stopped being Camilla against Anne. It had become a question about fairness, and fairness is the one argument that institution has never been able to win by staying quiet. Charles understood the danger of letting that grow without an answer. He authorized the household to confirm that visitor procedures were being standardized across senior royal households and that no extended family member would receive automatic access to official working areas through a personal relationship. Camilla read the wording carefully before it went out. Anne accepted it. William believed it went far enough to change the future. Charles wanted more than a statement, and he called the 3 of them together one last time. He looked across the room at the 3 people who had carried the whole thing from beginning to end. Anne, who noticed the breach. Camilla, whose family got caught inside it. William, who insisted the answer could not protect one household while punishing another. No investigation left to hide behind, no ambiguity left to preserve. Charles approved a single access policy for every senior royal household. Extended relatives can still be welcomed as private guests, and nothing about that changed. Family connection on its own no longer creates standing permission to enter restricted working areas or turn up anywhere near confidential royal business. The same visitor rules now apply across the whole monarchy instead of shifting from household to household, depending on who runs the office and who they like. That matters because the crisis exposed something genuinely dangerous. Once personal relationships and official authority blur together, even completely innocent arrangements start to look like privilege. And by the time anybody notices, 3 weeks of paperwork have already made it normal. Camilla listened while Charles made it clear the rule would not single out her family, Catherine's relatives, Anne's family, William's private connections, every extended royal circle, the same limits for all of them. She accepted the decision and asked for one thing in return. Her children should stop being treated as symbols of misconduct when they had used access they believed had been properly approved because somebody in a palace office had told them it was. Charles agreed straight away. He told her they should never have been made to feel accused for a mistake created inside his own system, and he said it in front of his sister and his son. Then Anne turned toward Camilla and ended 20 years of something between them in about 4 sentences. She said she had never believed the Queen's family were the enemy. She has never once said anything of the kind in public or otherwise, and 40 years of people looking for it have found nothing. Her objection had always been to a privilege that nobody in that building could properly explain. Camilla answered without any anger left in it. She admitted Anne had been right to question it, even though the way the truth came out had been painful for all of them, and for the first time since that briefing stopped, neither of those 2 women needed to defend herself in a room. Then Charles made the accountability final, and this is the part that did not make the front pages. The household official who brought in the original authorization was permanently removed from any responsibility involving visitor access. The old standing designation was not suspended. It was abolished completely, deleted out of the system, rather than left sitting there dormant, waiting for somebody to reactivate it in 5 years. No hidden exception left, no vague wording still in the file. Then the king went back to the same briefing room where all of it had started. The attendance list was clean. Anne was there. Camilla was there. William was there. Nobody else was anywhere near that corridor, and somebody had walked the length of it beforehand to be certain of that. The adjoining door was shut. Somebody had checked it twice. Charles put his hand flat on the table and told the room to begin. That was the real verdict. Camilla was not defeated, and Anne did not win. William turned a family argument into a standard that will outlive every person who was in that room. And Charles proved that protecting his wife never required protecting a privilege nobody could explain. And I keep going back to one part of it, which is the reason this story is worth half an hour of your time. Nobody in that palace did anything dramatic. Camilla asked for her relatives to stop being held up at a gate, which is the most ordinary request a person can make. Charles knew nothing. Anne overheard a sentence. William was not in the building. One official typed 3 words into an internal record, a practical simplification. And with those 3 words, without a signature, without a meeting, without telling a single member of that family, somebody moved the boundary of a royal palace and let it sit there for 3 weeks, looking completely normal on a list that almost nobody ever reads. Anne read it. One woman in that entire building read a line on an entry list and thought about it for 4 seconds instead of turning the page. And that is the whole reason the boundary of a royal palace is where it is supposed to be tonight. And the person who typed those 3 words spent 3 weeks knowing exactly what had been done and said nothing to anybody. Right up to the afternoon, a princess leaned toward her brother and asked him to explain the people standing behind the door. Anne read it.